answering-christianity.com. Tonight we will discuss Jesus getting tempted by Satan and, quote, suffering, end quote, from him in the New Testament, and him doubting God Almighty and having second thoughts about him. I'd like to first post an audio clip by Sam Shamoun where he tried to respond to these points, and then I will refute him after that, inshallah, if Allah Almighty is willing. Here's Sam Shamoun's speech.
Them know in the text that this is what we're doing. But now let me answer for sake and Bobby. The question, why did Jesus accept Satan's invitation? Well, I guess you didn't hear me. I thought it was clear to the room. The reason why Jesus accepts his invitation is to conquer and overcome and to defeat him. He's defeating Satan by overcoming every temptation and trial he puts him to. Now, how is that not clear? The very purpose of Jesus going into the desert, and I said this in the beginning and everyone heard it, let me repeat it again. The very purpose of Jesus going into the desert, was so that Satan could tempt him and try to cause him to fail. Now, does everyone see that? Put a 1. Now this guy's trying to be silly and saying, oh, obeying Satan is a sin. Oh, really? So you're saying because Jesus obeyed Satan, that's a sin? Or should you see it for what it says? God's will was, the Father's will was, that Christ enter the wilderness and face Satan's every trial and overcome and destroy him.
Okay, since we all agree that Satan has indeed tempted Jesus, then this, according to James chapter 1 verses 13 through 15 in the New Testament, not only clearly proves that Jesus is not the creator of the universe, but also it proves that Jesus actually sinned against God Almighty when he allowed Satan to tempt him. Here is what the verses of James chapter 1 verses 13 through 15 say. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So Jesus did have evil desires when he got tempted by Satan. This, to the so-called perfect and infallible Jesus, is sin by itself, because we wouldn't expect evil desires by someone like him. And it certainly takes away the nonsense about him being perfect, because only God Almighty is perfect and no one else. Now, me as a Muslim, I believe that Jesus was a creation of God Almighty, a great prophet and a great servant to God Almighty, and he certainly was not perfect. Now, before we get into the verses where Jesus got tempted, I'd like to add that Jesus violated the Bible's Old Testament and his own commands in the New Testament about covet and lust. Let us look at Exodus chapter 20 verse 17. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Okay? So a person is forbidden to covet or lust after anything that his neighbor owns or has or possesses. Also, let us look at Jesus' own command in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 5 verse 28. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Yet Jesus coveted the world in Matthew chapter 4 verses 8 through 9, and Luke chapter 4 verses 5 through 6. And by the way, the world that Jesus coveted does include sexual immorality in it, such as fornication and lust, that Jesus himself forbade. And I will demonstrate shortly from the Bible's verses that Jesus' temptation and coveting did include those immoralities. Let us look at Matthew chapter 4 verses 8 through 9. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. And in Luke chapter 4 verses 5 through 6, the devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor, for it has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. So clearly, the law of covet and lust had been violated by Jesus when he was tempted by Satan, and when he was giving second thoughts about the world and its kingdoms. Lust by itself is another form of temptation. Okay? When a man looks at a woman lustfully, he is actually being tempted to have sex with her, illegal sex with her, such as fornication or adultery. And Jesus considered that by itself, the temptation itself, he considered it an adultery. Okay? Yet, Jesus himself violated his laws on covet and lust when he coveted the world and its kingdoms and gave them second thoughts. He actually doubted God Almighty and gave serious thoughts to following Satan and his footstep. And by the way, the splendor and pleasure of the world that Jesus seriously considered does include sex with women, as was the case with the Bible's prophets with their harems and slave girls. Let us look at the following examples from the Old Testament. Let us look at the book of Numbers, chapter 31, verses 17 through 18. Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every virgin girl who has never slept with a man. And also in 2 Samuel, second book of Samuel, chapter 5, verse 13, and first book of Chronicles, chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, and 4, and chapter 14, verse 3, King David had 6 wives and numerous concubines. Also in the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verse 3, King Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And also in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 11, verse 21, King Solomon's son, Rehoboam, had 18 wives and 60 concubines. So clearly, Jesus' thoughts about accepting Satan's offer did include the pleasures of this world, which obviously and indisputably includes lust and sex with women, especially with kings, as we saw the kings of the Bible, which also were the prophets, and their harems and all the harems and the slave girls that they had, and actually all the slaying, the killing of all the boys and the non-virgin women and girls, and only keeping the virgin girls. Which, by the way, according to the Jewish Talmud, they were as young as 3 years old. The people of Moses, the men of Moses, had sex with virgin girls who were as young as 3. Let us look at few quotes from the Talmud. This is from Sanhedrin number 7/55b. Come and take note, a girl 3 years and 1 day old is betrothed by intercourse. In other words, she was deflowered, sexually deflowered by a man's genital through sexual intercourse. Also, let us look at Mishnah Nidda number 5/4. A girl 3 years and 1 day old is betrothed by intercourse. A girl 3 years old may be betrothed through an act of sexual intercourse. The words of R. Mir